No one expects an autopsy report to silence an entire room. But that's exactly what happened the moment the document surfaced. Because this wasn't just paperwork. It wasn't just medical language. It wasn't just another headline in a never-ending news cycle. It was a line-by-line dismantling of a Hollywood legend. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And once people started reading it closely, nothing made sense anymore. Let me ask you something. How does a family that looks perfect from the outside unravel in a single night? How do decades of fame, laughter, and success end not with applause, but with questions no one wants to answer? That's the mystery at the center of this story. And before you assume you already know how this ends, pause. Because the details most people skipped over, those are the ones that change everything. This story doesn't begin with police lights. It doesn't begin with a crime scene. It doesn't even begin with tragedy. It begins with a party. A warm, glittering Hollywood gathering. The kind filled with laughter, inside jokes, and familiar faces who've known each other for decades. A holiday celebration hosted by one of the industry's most recognizable comedians. The kind of night where everyone relaxes because everyone feels safe. Or so it seemed. Multiple guests would later say the same thing. Nothing felt wrong. The couple at the center of this story, let's call them Daniel and Evelyn Hart, were in high spirits. Daniel, a celebrated filmmaker whose work shaped generations. Evelyn, his partner in life and business, known for her warmth, intelligence, and fierce loyalty to family. They arrived together. They stayed together. They laughed. They posed for photos. But here's the first crack in the story. Several witnesses independently recalled something subtle, something easy to dismiss at the time. Daniel kept checking his phone. Not obsessively. Not anxiously. Just enough to be noticed. And Evelyn, she smiled through it. But her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt completely alone? That was the impression some guests later described. Not that the couple was unhappy, but that something unspoken hovered between them. Like a conversation that had been postponed, not resolved. Still, they stayed until late. Too late, according to some. Because within hours of leaving that party, everything changed. The next morning, the news broke. Daniel and Evelyn Hart were found dead in their home. The initial reports were brief, carefully worded, almost sterile. Authorities confirmed the deaths. An investigation was underway. No immediate suspects named. But then came the autopsy report. And that's where the silence began. Because the official findings didn't just confirm homicide. They raised questions that reporters weren't prepared to ask out loud. Questions like, why were there signs of multiple injuries when there was supposedly no forced entry? Why did the timeline not align with the couple's last known movements? Why did certain details contradict early police statements? And most chilling of all, why did the report suggest the incident unfolded over time, not all at once? Think about that. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't random. It wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was deliberate. And the more experts quietly reviewed the findings, the clearer it became that someone in that house knew exactly what they were doing. Here's where the story takes its most uncomfortable turn. Because the person who discovered the bodies wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a housekeeper. It was their adult child. Their daughter, we'll call her Rowan, had gone to check on them after unanswered calls that morning. According to sources familiar with the investigation, she initially assumed her parents were sleeping in, until she realized they weren't responding, until she walked further into the house. And then, nothing prepares you for what comes next. Rowan's call to emergency services was reportedly calm at first. Too calm, some said. Controlled. Measured. Then her voice changed. Investigators would later note that shift, not as evidence, but as a moment that stayed with them. Because trauma doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like shock wearing the mask of composure. But Rowan wasn't the only family member investigators wanted to speak with. There was also a son, Nick. And this is where everything fractures. Nick Hart had lived on the property in a separate guest house. Close enough to hear. Close enough to know routines. Close enough to be part of daily life, but far enough to live independently. And according to multiple sources, the relationship between Nick and his parents had grown strained in recent months. Not publicly, not explosively, quietly. Have you ever noticed how the most dangerous conflicts aren't the loud ones, but the ones that simmer? Friends described Nick as intelligent, intense, and deeply private. Someone who carried emotional weight without always knowing where to put it. And on the night before the deaths, there was an argument. Not at the party, not in public, but after. A family friend later claimed voices were raised, that old grievances resurfaced, that words were said that couldn't be taken back. Was it just another family disagreement? Or was it the final spark in something that had been building for years? Here's the part that most headlines rushed past. Police believe the deaths occurred in the early morning hours. After the party. After the house lights went out. After the world assumed everyone was safe at home. Which raises a chilling possibility. What if the most important part of this story didn't happen in darkness, but in silence? No neighbors reported screams. No alarms were triggered. No signs of struggle spilled into public view. Whatever happened, happened quietly. And that brings us back to the autopsy report. Because buried in clinical language were implications that changed how investigators viewed the entire case. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't the result of a stranger breaking in. It suggested familiarity, control, time. And once that realization set in, the investigation shifted focus, not outward, but inward, toward family, toward history, toward things that had never been meant for public scrutiny. What was said during that argument? Who heard what? Who left their phone behind? And who didn't? And most importantly, who had the most to lose if certain truths came out? Because as the days passed, one thing became painfully clear. The autopsy didn't just document how Daniel and Evelyn died. It quietly exposed a family already breaking long before that night ever arrived. And just when everyone thought the worst details were already known, investigators uncovered something from the final hours before the deaths, something no one had mentioned publicly, something that would force everyone to rethink the entire timeline. Because once that detail surfaced, nothing about this case would ever look the same again. What was the one detail investigators didn't mention in the first press conference? That question alone sent reporters scrambling. Because when law enforcement stays quiet about something early on, it's rarely accidental. It's strategic. It means the detail is either too sensitive, too confusing, or too revealing to release before they understand its implications. And in this case, it was all three. Here's the detail. During the review of phone records and home security data, investigators discovered a short window of activity that didn't align with anyone's statements. A gap, a sliver of time that shouldn't have existed. According to the timeline provided by family members, Daniel and Evelyn Hart returned home shortly after the party. They exchanged a few messages with friends. Lights in the main house went off. Everything, on the surface, followed routine. But the internal system logs told a different story. A door sensor was triggered hours later. Not the front door. Not the side entrance. The interior door connecting the main house to the guest house. That door opened. And then it closed. No one had mentioned that. Not Rowan. Not Nick. Not even the first responding officers in their initial notes. So let me ask you something. If you had nothing to hide, why wouldn't you mention it? At first, investigators assumed it was a technical error. Systems glitch all the time, especially older ones, especially in large properties with overlapping sensors. But when technicians double-checked the data, the result was the same. The door had opened at 2:17 a.m., and someone had stayed inside the main house for nearly 40 minutes. 40 minutes. That's not a quick check-in. That's not grabbing a charger or borrowing something. That's time. Enough time to talk. Enough time to argue. Enough time to make irreversible decisions. So who was it? That's where the contradictions began piling up. Nick told investigators he stayed in the guest house all night. He claimed he'd gone to bed early after a tense conversation with his parents, wanting space. He said he didn't want the argument to escalate. Rowan, on the other hand, said she wasn't on the property at all that night. She'd been at her own place, only coming over in the morning after repeated unanswered calls. And yet, the door log didn't care about intentions. It didn't care about family dynamics. It only recorded movement. Someone crossed that threshold. And once that fact was established, the investigation took a sharp turn. Detectives began asking a different kind of question. Not who did this, but what happened inside that house after everyone thought the night was over. Because now, the story wasn't about a sudden tragedy. It was about escalation. Neighbors were re-interviewed. Friends were quietly contacted again. People who'd been at the party were asked a simple question. Did Daniel or Evelyn say anything unusual before they left? And that's when a second detail surfaced. Multiple guests remembered Evelyn pulling one close friend aside near the end of the evening. Her voice was low, her tone serious. According to that friend, Evelyn said something that stuck with her all night. I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this. At the time, it sounded like stress, a marriage under pressure, a family stretched thin. But after the deaths, that sentence took on a different weight. Keep doing what? Protecting someone? Covering something up? Pretending everything was fine? And if Evelyn felt that way, did Daniel feel it too? Here's where the emotional fault lines really begin to show. Because people close to the family described two very different parenting styles. Daniel was the optimist, the fixer, the one who believed problems could always be talked through, softened, reframed. Evelyn was the realist, the boundary setter, the one who worried about consequences. And when it came to Nick, those differences mattered. Nick had struggled for years to find his footing. That wasn't a secret. But what wasn't public was how much pressure that placed on the household. Friends said Daniel often defended him. He just needs time. He's figuring things out. He'll land on his feet. Evelyn wasn't so sure. She worried about patterns repeating, about accountability being delayed, about what would happen if they kept absorbing the fallout instead of addressing it. So when the argument happened that night, it wasn't about one thing. It was about everything. Years of unspoken tension compressed into one conversation. And according to one family friend, something changed during that argument. Nick wasn't just defensive. He was angry, not explosive, controlled, quiet. The kind of anger that doesn't burn hot, it freezes. Now here's a detail that sent chills through investigators. When forensic analysts examined the scene, they noticed signs that suggested the incident didn't happen all at once. There were indications of movement between rooms, pauses, interruptions. This wasn't a single moment. It unfolded, which means there were opportunities for it to stop. Think about that. At multiple points, someone could have walked away. Someone could have called for help. Someone could have de-escalated. But they didn't. Why? That's the question that keeps coming back. And then came the digital footprint. Nick's phone showed no outgoing calls during that window. But it did show something else. His device briefly connected to the main house's Wi-Fi network at 2:19 a.m., 2 minutes after the door sensor was triggered. That connection lasted 37 minutes. Then it disconnected. The timing was almost identical. Coincidence? Maybe. But investigators don't build cases on coincidences. They build them on patterns. When confronted with this data, Nick's explanation was simple. He said his phone sometimes auto-connected when the signal was stronger. He insisted he never entered the house. He claimed he fell asleep early and didn't wake until morning. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because parts of his explanation were true, experts confirmed that the Wi-Fi overlap could happen under certain conditions. The system logs didn't capture facial images, only movement. There was no clear video showing who crossed that door, which meant the case wasn't clean. It was messy, and messy cases are the most dangerous kind, because they leave room for doubt. Public opinion began to split. Some people immediately suspected Nick. Others warned against jumping to conclusions. And then there were those who asked a third question. What if Nick wasn't alone that night? What if someone else knew about the argument? What if someone else had access? What if the family dynamics were more complicated than anyone realized? That question gained traction when investigators uncovered something else. The guest list from the party included someone who wasn't just a friend, a business associate, someone who'd recently been involved in a dispute with Daniel and Evelyn over a financial decision that never made headlines. A disagreement that involved money and control and silence. Could that person have followed them home? Could they have returned later? Could the door log be misleading? Suddenly, the case expanded outward again. And just when it seemed like investigators were chasing too many possibilities, they found a message. A single text sent from Evelyn's phone earlier that evening. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't threatening. It simply said, "We need to talk tonight. No more delays." That message wasn't sent to Nick. It was sent to someone else. Someone whose name hadn't appeared in the story yet. And once investigators realized who that message was addressed to, they understood that the argument everyone focused on might not have been the most important one that night. Because whatever Evelyn planned to say, whatever truth she was ready to confront, It may have set events in motion long before anyone raised their voice. And the moment that message came to light, the investigation shifted again. This time, toward a secret no one outside the family was supposed to know. A secret that reframed every relationship in that house. And if that secret became public, it wouldn't just explain what happened. It would destroy reputations, end careers, and expose a betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Who was Evelyn really trying to confront that night? That was the question investigators couldn't shake, because the message didn't fit the narrative everyone had already accepted. It didn't point inward toward family conflict the way people expected. It pointed sideways, towards someone who existed just outside the emotional core of the household, close enough to matter, distant enough to avoid suspicion. At first, detectives assumed the text was mundane, a delayed conversation, a business follow-up, something that only looked important in hindsight. But once they traced the recipient, the room went quiet. The message hadn't been sent to Nick. It hadn't been sent to Rowan. It hadn't been sent to a close friend. It was sent to someone the family rarely mentioned publicly. Let's call him Marcus Hale. Marcus wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't famous. But he had been part of Daniel and Evelyn's professional orbit for years. Quietly, consistently, invisibly, he handled things people didn't like to talk about. Contracts, settlements, problems that needed to disappear without headlines. And for a long time, Marcus had been useful. Too useful. Here's the contradiction that immediately caught investigators' attention. Publicly, Daniel and Evelyn appeared united. Their professional ventures looked clean, successful, transparent. Privately, however, there were signs of strain. Emails flagged by forensic analysts revealed disagreements over how certain matters had been handled in the past. Decisions that were legally acceptable, but ethically uncomfortable. Evelyn, in particular, seemed uneasy. She questioned timelines. She questioned silence. She questioned whether doing nothing was the same as doing the right thing. And Marcus? Marcus didn't like questions. According to colleagues, he preferred problems solved quietly, quickly, permanently. So when Evelyn sent that message, "We need to talk tonight," no more delays. It wasn't casual. It was a line in the sand. And here's the part that reframed everything. Marcus responded. Not immediately, but shortly after midnight. His reply was brief. "We'll talk soon." Not tonight. Not tonight. Why refuse? Because he couldn't come? Or because he didn't want to? Investigators now had to consider something unsettling. What if the argument everyone focused on wasn't the final conflict of the night? What if it was only the loud one? Because some of the most consequential confrontations don't involve shouting. They involve ultimatums delivered calmly. Threats wrapped in professionalism. Evelyn had been preparing for one of those conversations for weeks. That much was clear from her notes. Yes, notes. During a search of her personal office, investigators discovered a small notebook tucked inside a drawer. Nothing dramatic. No confessions. No accusations. Just questions. Why was this approved? Who authorized that decision? What happens if this becomes public? Page after page, the same concern appeared again and again. Risk. Evelyn was worried about exposure. Not of herself, but of the system they were part of. And the closer she got to confronting it, the more resistance she faced. From Marcus. From advisors. From people who benefited from things staying exactly as they were. Daniel, meanwhile, was torn. Friends described him as conflicted in the weeks before his death. He knew Evelyn was right to ask questions, but he also feared what the answers might do to their legacy. Have you ever noticed how people who build something beautiful are often terrified of looking too closely at its foundations? That was Daniel. He wanted peace. He wanted closure. He wanted everyone to stay together. Evelyn wanted truth. And when those two desires collide, something always breaks. Now let's return to the timeline. After the party, after the family argument, after the house went quiet, that's when Evelyn expected Marcus to show up. Or at least call. He did neither. Which raises a critical question. If Evelyn was prepared to confront him that night, what was she planning to say? Investigators believe she intended to force a decision. Either Nick returned to confront his parents again after the initial argument cooled, or someone else entered that house. Someone Evelyn had expected to see. Someone who had a reason to avoid being seen. Marcus had an alibi, of sorts. He claimed he was home all night. No witnesses. No proof otherwise. But his phone activity showed movement. Not physical movement, digital movement. He accessed files related to Daniel and Evelyn's accounts in the early morning hours. Why? He said he couldn't sleep. He said he was reviewing work. He said it meant nothing. Investigators weren't convinced. Because timing matters. And the closer they looked, the more they realized this wasn't a story about one night. It was a story about pressure. Pressure building across years. Across decisions. Across relationships that blurred professional and personal boundaries. By the time dawn arrived, something had already gone wrong beyond repair. And when Rowan found her parents that morning, she wasn't just discovering a tragedy. She was walking into the aftermath of a secret war no one had told her about. Here's the detail that chilled investigators the most. Rowan said she noticed something missing. Not valuables. Not electronics. Documents. Folders that used to sit in her mother's office were gone. The same folders Marcus had managed. The same folders Evelyn had been reviewing. And suddenly, the question wasn't just who was in the house that night. It was who left with something. Because if those documents were removed before dawn, then someone knew exactly what mattered. And that meant intent. Which brings us to the realization that changed everything. The deaths may have silenced two voices, but they didn't erase what those voices were about to say. And as investigators prepared to confront Marcus with what they'd uncovered, they received a call that stopped them cold. Another witness had come forward. Someone who saw a car leaving the property before sunrise. Not Nick's. Not Rowan's. A vehicle registered to a shell company. A company tied directly to Marcus Hale. And once that connection was confirmed, the investigation crossed a line it could never step back from. Because now, the question wasn't whether this was a family tragedy. It was whether it was something far more calculated. What if the most important witness wasn't inside the house, but passing by it? That single possibility forced investigators to rethink everything. Because up until now, the case had been framed around interiors, conversations behind closed doors, family arguments, private messages, digital footprints hidden inside devices. But a car seen leaving the property before sunrise? That pulled the story out into the open. And once something enters the open, it can be seen from angles no one anticipated. The witness came forward reluctantly, not because they were afraid, but because they didn't think what they saw mattered. That alone should make you pause. How many critical details go unreported simply because the person who notices them doesn't realize they're important? According to the witness, they were driving past the Hart residence in the early morning hours. It wasn't unusual. The road was quiet. The neighborhood was known for privacy, not traffic. And yet, something caught their attention. A car was exiting the property. Slowly. Deliberately. Not speeding. Not rushing. Almost careful. At the time, the witness assumed it belonged to a staff member or an overnight guest. Nothing about the scene screamed emergency. No flashing lights. No visible distress. So they kept driving. It wasn't until the news broke later that morning that the image resurfaced in their mind. Clearer, sharper, heavier. And when they replayed it, one detail refused to fade. The license plate. They didn't memorize it. They didn't write it down. But they remembered enough. Enough to narrow it. Enough for investigators to pull records. And when those records came back, the room went silent again. Because the vehicle wasn't registered to the Hart family. It wasn't registered to any staff member. It wasn't registered to a neighbor. It was registered to a shell company. A shell company Marcus Hale had used before. Now let's slow this down. Shell companies are legal. They're common. They're often used for privacy. But context matters. Why would a vehicle tied to Marcus be leaving the property at that hour? Especially when he claimed he never went there. Especially when Evelyn expected to confront him. Especially when documents from her office were missing. The coincidence threshold had been crossed. Investigators now had motive, opportunity, and movement. But they still needed proof. And proof doesn't come from assumptions. It comes from patterns. So they dug deeper. Traffic cameras. Private security feeds from nearby properties. Toll records. Slowly, the picture sharpened. The car had been in the area longer than initially believed. It didn't just arrive and leave. It circled. Twice. Which suggests hesitation. Decision-making. Someone weighing options. And that detail matters, because people who act on impulse don't circle the block. They act. This person didn't. Now let's talk about Nick again. Because while attention shifted toward Marcus, Nick's behavior after the deaths remained under scrutiny. He didn't flee. He didn't lawyer up immediately. He cooperated. But cooperation doesn't equal innocence. Investigators noticed something subtle. Nick's story never changed, but it never expanded either. He answered questions, but he didn't volunteer information. He seemed guarded, not defensive, not panicked, contained. And that containment made some detectives uneasy, because it suggested someone who knew more than they were saying, but not necessarily everything. Here's where the emotional complexity of this case truly comes into focus. What if Nick suspected something was wrong, but didn't know how wrong? What if he believed his parents were entangled in something dangerous, but didn't realize how close it was to home? That possibility gained traction when investigators uncovered an email Nick had drafted weeks earlier. It was never sent. It sat in his drafts folder, and it read like this: "I don't know what's going on anymore. I feel like I'm being protected from something I should probably know." That line hit hard, because it reframed Nick not as a villain, but as someone caught between truths. Someone sensing danger without seeing its shape. Now combine that with Evelyn's notes. Her questions. Her unease. Her insistence that things could no longer continue quietly. It paints a picture of a household standing on a fault line. One more step, one more conversation, and the ground gives way. Investigators began to believe the argument that night wasn't the cause, it was the symptom. The real conflict had been unfolding in parallel. Between Evelyn and Marcus. Between truth and silence. Between exposure and control. So what did Marcus want? According to people who worked with him, Marcus valued one thing above all else. Stability. Not emotional stability. Structural stability. Systems working as designed. People staying in their lanes. Problems resolved before they became visible. Evelyn threatened that system. Not intentionally, but inevitably. Because she asked the wrong questions. And she asked them at the wrong time. So when she said, "No more delays," Marcus heard something else. A deadline. And deadlines make people desperate. But here's the contradiction. If Marcus wanted to stop Evelyn from speaking out, why not negotiate? Why not compromise? Why escalate? That question haunted investigators until they found the missing piece. Money. Not greed, leverage. There were accounts tied to old agreements that only Evelyn had full access to. Accounts that could expose decisions Marcus had made without full authorization. If Evelyn spoke, those accounts would be examined. And if they were examined, careers would end. So when Marcus entered that property, if he did, it may not have been to argue. It may have been to retrieve something. Documents. Access. Control. And once that goal was achieved, everything else became collateral damage. Now let's return to Rowan. Because Rowan noticed the missing folders immediately. She knew her mother's habits. She knew what lived where. And when she mentioned it to investigators, it shifted the tone of the case. This wasn't just about who was present. It was about what was taken. And the fact that someone took something means forethought. It means planning. Which means whatever happened wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. As investigators prepared to confront Marcus with the vehicle evidence, they received another alert. One of the missing folders had been accessed digitally. Not downloaded. Not shared. Accessed. From an IP address linked to Marcus's office. After the deaths. Let that sink in. If he had nothing to do with that night, why access those files afterward? Why not alert authorities? Why not preserve evidence? Why look? The answer was obvious. He was checking exposure. Checking damage. Checking whether what he feared had already been set in motion. And then, just as the case seemed to be pointing firmly outward, something unexpected happened. Nick requested another interview. Voluntarily. No prompting. No pressure. And when he sat down across from investigators, he said something that redefined his role in the story. He said he heard a car that night. Not clearly. Not definitively. But enough to remember it later. He hadn't mentioned it before because he assumed it was his parents' guest. Because he assumed they were handling something privately. And that assumption, that trust, may have been the most tragic part of all. Because if Nick heard a car, then someone else was there. And if someone else was there, then the family argument wasn't the final act. It was the distraction. And as investigators prepared to bring Marcus in for formal questioning, they realized they were no longer dealing with a simple chain of events. They were dealing with layers. Layers of loyalty. Layers of fear. Layers of silence. And just as they thought they were closing in, they discovered something even more unsettling. Marcus had booked a flight. Not after the deaths. Before. A flight scheduled for the morning after. Which means he planned to leave regardless of what happened. And that raises the most chilling question yet. Was that flight an escape? Or was it part of the plan? Why would someone book a flight before a tragedy and then cancel it after? That question haunted investigators more than any other. Because planning to leave isn't suspicious on its own. People travel all the time. But timing is everything. And in this case, the timing didn't just raise eyebrows. It redrew the map of intent. Marcus Hale's flight was scheduled for early morning. Not midday. Not evening. Early. The kind of departure you take when you want distance as quickly as possible. Yet the flight was never boarded. It was canceled. Not days later. Not after questioning. Not after legal pressure. It was canceled just hours after the deaths were discovered. And that decision changed everything. Because canceling a flight means one of two things. Either the reason you were leaving no longer exists, or leaving would make you look guilty. Which one was it? Investigators pulled the airline records. The cancellation wasn't automated. It wasn't weather-related. It wasn't a scheduling error. It was manual. Marcus himself had made the call. So what happened between booking the flight and canceling it? To answer that, detectives turned to phone records. Marcus's phone activity that night was strange. Long stretches of silence. Then bursts of activity. Texts sent but unsaved. Calls made and deleted from visible logs. Someone was thinking, reconsidering, recalculating. And then there was the call. A single phone call placed at 5:42 a.m. It lasted less than 2 minutes. But it was enough. The call was placed to a burner number. Unregistered. Untraceable by conventional means. Except for one thing. The tower it pinged. The same tower that serviced the Hart property. Now pause. That doesn't mean Marcus was physically there at that moment. Towers overlap. Signals travel. But investigators don't ignore patterns. And this was becoming a pattern. Movement near the property. Digital access to sensitive files. A car registered to his company. A flight booked, then canceled. A call connected to the same geographic area. Each detail on its own could be explained. Together? They formed a narrative Marcus couldn't talk his way out of. So investigators prepared for the interview. But before they could bring him in, something unexpected happened. Marcus's attorney reached out first. That alone was telling. He hadn't been summoned yet. He hadn't been charged. And yet, legal representation was already in place. The message was polite, cooperative, calm. Marcus was willing to answer questions, but only under specific conditions. And those conditions raised red flags. He wanted advance notice of topics. He wanted to avoid questions about specific documents. He wanted assurances that certain communications would be considered confidential. Investigators declined. Because when someone starts drawing boundaries before being accused, it usually means they know exactly where the danger lies. When Marcus finally sat down for questioning, he looked composed. Not nervous. Not arrogant. Professional. He answered questions carefully. Precisely. Like someone used to controlling narratives. He denied going to the Hart property that night. He denied removing any documents. He denied involvement beyond professional dealings. But then came the moment that cracked the surface. An investigator slid a still image across the table. Not of a person, of a car. Marcus didn't react immediately, but his eyes flickered. Just once. Enough to be noticed. He asked where the image came from. Not what it was. Not when it was taken. Where it came from. And that told investigators everything they needed to know. Because innocent people ask different questions. They ask why. They ask how. Marcus asked about source, which meant he understood exposure. When confronted with the shell company registration, Marcus changed tactics. He didn't deny ownership. He reframed it. He said the vehicle was used by multiple associates. That he didn't personally drive it often. That someone else could have had access. Technically plausible. Emotionally hollow. Then investigators asked about the flight. And this time, Marcus paused. He said the trip was business-related. That he canceled because circumstances changed. What circumstances? An investigator asked. Marcus hesitated. Personal reasons, he said. And there it was. The phrase people use when they don't want to explain, but don't want to lie outright. Now let's talk about Evelyn again. Because while investigators focused on Marcus, they were also reconstructing Evelyn's final decisions. Her calendar showed she'd blocked time the following week. Meetings canceled. Commitments postponed. It looked like preparation. Like someone clearing space for something difficult. And that something was now missing. The folders. The accounts. The evidence. If Evelyn planned to expose something, she didn't get the chance. but she may have taken steps to protect it. Because investigators uncovered something else. A secure backup. Not on a computer. Not on a cloud service. A physical device. Hidden. Rowan didn't know about it. Daniel may not have either. But Evelyn did. And she told one person. Nick. According to Nick, his mother had given him something weeks earlier. She told him to keep it safe. Not to open it unless she told him to. He thought it was paperwork. He didn't ask questions. Why would he? Parents ask children to hold on to things all the time. But after the deaths, Nick remembered. And he turned it over. That device contained partial records. Not everything. But enough. Enough to show that Marcus had exceeded his authority on multiple occasions. Enough to show decisions were made without full consent. Enough to show Evelyn was right to be worried. And here's the part that shifts the emotional weight back onto Nick. He hadn't known what he was holding, but he'd been holding it anyway. Which means when investigators questioned him earlier, he wasn't lying. He was ignorant. Ignorant of the scope. Ignorant of the danger. Ignorant of how close he was to the truth. That revelation softened some suspicion around him, but it didn't erase all doubt. Because Nick still heard the car. He still argued with his parents. He still lived steps away. And trauma doesn't erase involvement. It complicates it. Now return to Marcus. When investigators revealed they'd recovered Evelyn's backup, his demeanor changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. His shoulders tightened. His answers shortened. And then he asked a question of his own. What exactly is on that device? Investigators didn't answer. They didn't need to. Because the question itself was the confession. Marcus wasn't worried about being falsely accused. He was worried about being exposed. And that distinction matters. But just as it seemed the case was closing in on him, another twist emerged. Marcus hadn't acted alone. Phone records showed repeated contact between Marcus and a third party in the days leading up to the deaths. Someone who worked in security. Someone who knew the property layout. Someone who knew how to enter without triggering alarms. And that person had vanished. Not missing. Not abducted. Gone. Resigned from their firm. Disconnected their number. Left no forwarding address. Which meant the case was no longer about one man protecting himself. It was about a network. A network that may have believed silencing Evelyn was necessary. Or at least, preventing her from acting. Whether that intent crossed into violence was the question investigators still had to answer. And as they prepared warrants, subpoenas, and arrests, they realized something else. The autopsy didn't just tell them how Daniel and Evelyn died. It told them something far more disturbing. Whatever happened wasn't rushed. It wasn't panicked. It was controlled. Which meant whoever was responsible didn't expect chaos. They expected compliance. And that suggests a plan. A plan that went wrong. Because Evelyn didn't stay silent. She left a trail. And that trail was now leading investigators somewhere they hadn't expected. Straight into the heart of an industry that survives on secrets. And as that realization set in, one final piece of information arrived. Marcus's canceled flight had been rebooked. Not overseas. Not far away. Just one state over. For the next morning. Which means he wasn't running. He was repositioning. And the question investigators now had to answer was chillingly simple. Was Marcus preparing to disappear? Or preparing to fight? What if the most dangerous person in this story wasn't the one in the headlines? That question surfaced the moment investigators traced Marcus's repeated calls to a name buried deep in security records. A name that never appeared in public articles. A name that didn't belong to family, friends, or business partners. It belonged to someone who knew the house better than almost anyone. Let's call him Aaron Pike. Aaron wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't an executive. He wasn't even a long-term employee. He was a consultant. The kind brought. Now here's the emotional contradiction at the center of this section. Marcus insisted he never intended harm. He framed his actions as damage control, as prevention, as protecting people from consequences they didn't fully understand. And maybe, in his mind, that was true. But when you start involving security consultants off the books, when you start repositioning vehicles, when you start removing documents, intent becomes irrelevant. Outcome takes over. Investigators finally located Aaron 2 states away, staying under a short-term rental agreement. When they knocked on the door, he didn't run. He didn't deny who he was. He looked relieved, as if hiding had been harder than being found. Aaron's first statement was simple. I didn't know anyone was going to die. That sentence matters. because it acknowledges involvement without admitting intent. He explained that Marcus had contacted him about a situation involving a client who was becoming unpredictable, someone who might expose sensitive information, someone who needed to be slowed down, not silenced. Slowed. Aaron said he was asked for advice, not action. Advice on access, advice on schedules, advice on how to retrieve documents without causing alarm. And according to Aaron, he gave that advice. That alone changed the case. Because advising someone how to enter a home undetected is participation, even if you never step inside. Aaron claimed he refused to go to the property, claimed he stayed away, claimed he regretted getting involved at all. But regret doesn't erase consequence. When investigators asked him about the car seen leaving the property, Aaron hesitated. Then he said something that reframed everything. That wasn't supposed to happen. Those 4 words sent a shock through the room. Not supposed to happen implies expectation, a plan, a boundary that was crossed. Aaron explained that the original idea, as it was presented to him, involved retrieving documents while the occupants were asleep. No confrontation, no interaction, quiet, controlled, temporary. He said he warned Marcus against direct contact, warned him that emotions complicate operations, that family dynamics make situations unpredictable. Marcus, according to Aaron, didn't listen. He felt cornered, Aaron said, and cornered people improvise. Now pause and think about that. Improvisation in high-stakes situations is dangerous because it introduces variables no one controls, and that's where plans unravel. Investigators asked Aaron whether he believed Marcus entered the house himself. Aaron didn't answer immediately. Then he said, if he did, it wasn't what we discussed. That answer didn't clear Marcus. It implicated him further, because it suggested Marcus went off script, which aligns with the evidence. The circling car, the delayed exit, the missing documents. It all pointed to someone adapting in real time. Now let's return to Nick. Because while investigators were piecing together Marcus and Aaron's roles, Nick was undergoing his own reckoning. He learned about the consultant. He learned about the documents. He learned that his parents' fears weren't hypothetical, and that realization crushed him. Friends described him as withdrawn, quiet, exhausted. He began questioning every interaction he'd had in recent months. Every argument, every dismissal, every moment he assumed his parents were just being overprotective. What if they were afraid? Not of him, but for him. That question reshaped Nick's emotional landscape, and it explained something investigators had struggled with. Why Nick's anger that night wasn't explosive. Why it was controlled. Why it felt restrained. He wasn't lashing out. He was demanding honesty. And when he didn't get it, he walked away. But someone else didn't. Someone else returned. Now here's the twist that complicates everything. Aaron admitted he sent Marcus a message that night. Not telling him to go to the house. Telling him not to. Wait until morning, he said he'd written. This isn't the time. That message was sent at 1:48 a.m. After the argument. Before the door sensor triggered. Which means Marcus made a choice. Against advice. Against caution. Against restraint. Why? Because Evelyn's message had changed the stakes. No more delays. That wasn't just pressure. That was a countdown. Marcus believed he was running out of time. And people who believe time is their enemy often act in ways they later claim were unintentional. Investigators now believe the night unfolded in stages. First, the argument between Nick and his parents. Emotional, raw, but not violent. Then silence. Then a decision made elsewhere. Then movement. And once that movement began, there was no undoing it. Aaron insisted he never intended harm. Investigators believed him, partially. But intention doesn't absolve contribution. And Marcus's role was becoming clearer by the hour. He wasn't reacting. He was acting. And that distinction is everything. As warrants were prepared and charges discussed, one final piece of evidence arrived. Audio. Not from the house. From a vehicle. The Shell Company vehicle. A dash recording that had autosave due to abrupt braking. The file was incomplete. Corrupted. But voices could be heard. 2 voices. One calm. One tense. The tense voice said something that froze the room. This wasn't supposed to go this far. The calm voice replied. Then you shouldn't have come yourself. That exchange didn't name names. But it didn't need to. Because only 2 people fit that dynamic. And the moment investigators heard it, they knew. The case wasn't about a single decision. It was about a chain. A chain of choices made by people who believed they were smarter than consequences. And that chain had snapped. But before arrests could be made, before charges could be filed, before the story could finally move toward resolution, Marcus did something no one expected. He made a public statement. Not a denial, not an apology, a warning. And what he said next would force everyone, investigators, family, and the public, to confront a truth far more uncomfortable than guilt or innocence. What kind of person speaks publicly when staying silent would be safer? That was the first question investigators asked themselves when Marcus Hale released his statement. Because this wasn't a leaked quote. It wasn't a courtroom filing. It wasn't a carefully worded denial whispered through an attorney. It was deliberate. Marcus chose a platform with reach. He chose language that sounded measured. And he chose a moment when the investigation was still unfolding. That choice alone was a message. The statement began calmly. He expressed sympathy. He acknowledged loss. He spoke about respect for the family. But then the tone shifted. He said there were forces at play the public didn't understand. He warned against simplified narratives. He suggested that exposing certain truths could cause collateral damage far beyond one family. And that's when investigators leaned forward. Because innocent people don't talk about collateral damage. They talk about clearing their name. Marcus wasn't trying to clear his. He was trying to control the frame. The statement didn't deny involvement outright. It reframed it. He positioned himself as a custodian of stability. Someone who had been asked, repeatedly, to manage risk. Someone who had made difficult decisions in complex environments. He claimed he had acted in good faith. That phrase is important. Good faith implies justification. And justification implies belief. Marcus believed what he did was necessary. But necessary for whom? That question haunted everyone who read the statement. Because the more people reread it, the clearer it became that Marcus wasn't speaking to the public. He was speaking to investigators. And he was speaking to people higher up. People who knew exactly what he meant. Now let's rewind slightly. Before the statement went live, Marcus had requested a private meeting with prosecutors. Not to confess. Not to negotiate. To inform. He told them there were documents they hadn't seen. Communications that predated Evelyn's concerns. Decisions made long before the Hart family ever realized the scope of what they were part of. He said if those materials were released without context, they would be misunderstood. And then he said something that changed the temperature in the room. You're not investigating an incident, he told them. You're investigating a system. That line landed hard. Because systems don't collapse from one person's actions. They collapse when pressure exposes cracks everyone agreed not to see. Investigators had suspected as much. But hearing it stated so plainly forced a reckoning. If Marcus was right, then charging him alone wouldn't end the story. It would begin it. Now let's talk about Rowan again. Because while Marcus was issuing warnings, Rowan was quietly absorbing truths she'd never expected to face. She learned about the consultant, the documents, the backups, the arguments. She learned that her parents had been carrying weight they never shared with her. And that realization hurt more than any headline. Rowan wasn't angry. She was heartbroken. Because she understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. Her parents weren't hiding secrets because they didn't trust her. They were hiding them because they were trying to protect her from a world that punishes honesty. That understanding reframed her role. She wasn't just a grieving daughter. She was now a guardian of intent. She made a decision. If the truth was coming out, it would come out accurately. Not twisted. Not weaponized. Not reduced to sound bites. So she cooperated fully. She handed over personal correspondence. She clarified timelines. She explained emotional context investigators couldn't see on paper. And her testimony added something crucial. Perspective. She explained that Evelyn had changed in the months before her death. Not withdrawn. Focused. Like someone who had reached a conclusion. She wasn't afraid, Rowan said. She was resolved. That distinction matters. Fear paralyzes. Resolve mobilizes. Evelyn wasn't reacting anymore. She was acting. And Marcus knew it. Now let's address the autopsy again. Not in terms of how Daniel and Evelyn died, but what the findings implied. The medical conclusions suggested control. Not chaos. Not panic. Which aligns with Aaron's admission. The plan was supposed to be quiet. Controlled. But something disrupted that control. Investigators now believe that disruption came from resistance. From Daniel. From Evelyn. from the fact that real people don't behave like variables in a plan. When confronted with unexpected resistance, someone made a choice. And that choice turned a containment effort into a tragedy. Now consider Marcus's statement in that light. He wasn't denying the outcome. He was denying sole responsibility. And that distinction forced investigators to widen their scope. Subpoenas expanded. Financial records were re-examined. Communications involving third parties were pulled into focus. And slowly, a larger picture emerged. Evelyn's concerns weren't isolated. She had been questioning a pattern that extended beyond her family. A pattern of decisions made quietly, of risks justified retroactively, of accountability deferred indefinitely. And Marcus wasn't the architect. He was the operator. That realization complicated everything. Because operators can be replaced, architects hide. Now let's talk about Nick again. Because while Marcus was reframing narratives, Nick was confronting guilt. Not legal guilt. Emotional guilt. He replayed that argument in his head endlessly. What if he'd stayed? What if he'd pushed harder? What if he'd listened differently? Those questions haunted him. And they mattered. Because trauma doesn't care about innocence. It assigns blame wherever it can find purchase. Investigators noticed something else about Nick. He wasn't trying to defend himself publicly. He wasn't giving interviews. He wasn't issuing statements. He stayed quiet. And that silence contrasted sharply with Marcus's visibility, which raised a question no one had asked yet. Who benefits from noise? Marcus was loud. Nick was not. Evelyn, in life, had been precise. Daniel had been conciliatory. Those traits mattered, because they explained why events unfolded the way they did. Now let's return to Marcus's warning. When pressed about what he meant by collateral damage, he finally clarified. He said certain disclosures would implicate people who had never been named. People with influence. People with reach. People capable of shaping outcomes. He suggested that if everything came out, the story wouldn't be about one family anymore. It would be about how decisions get made when power fears exposure. Investigators didn't dismiss this. They documented it. Because threats, even veiled ones, are evidence. And this one came with specificity. Dates, meetings, agreements. Marcus wasn't bluffing, but neither were investigators. Because the existence of a system doesn't absolve an individual from acting within it. And when Marcus realized the investigation wasn't backing down, he shifted again. He offered cooperation. Not full. Selective. He would provide information if certain conditions were met. Immunity discussions began quietly. Not because prosecutors trusted him, because they recognized leverage. Marcus knew things. Things Evelyn had been close to exposing. Things that explained why that night unfolded the way it did. And that knowledge was now currency. As negotiations unfolded, something unexpected happened. The backup device Evelyn had hidden yielded more than anticipated. Not just financial records. Correspondence. Emails that showed Evelyn had already reached out to regulators. Not to report. To inquire. She had been asking questions. The kind that trigger audits. The kind that start clocks. And those inquiries were time-stamped. Days before the deaths. Which means time truly was running out. Marcus wasn't reacting to pressure. He was racing a deadline. And that reframed his actions entirely. Because desperation isn't born from guilt. It's born from exposure. Now pause and think about this. If Evelyn had lived, the system might have been scrutinized. If she died, the system might remain intact. That's the calculation investigators now had to confront. And it wasn't a comfortable one. Because it suggested motive far beyond personal conflict. It suggested preservation. Preservation of power. Preservation of secrecy. Preservation of narratives. As prosecutors weighed their options, one final development shifted the ground again. The person who had authorized the shell company vehicle, the one Marcus used, wasn't Marcus. It was someone else. Someone higher. Someone whose name had appeared nowhere in the investigation so far. And that discovery meant the case wasn't narrowing. It was expanding toward a level no one had prepared for. Because if Marcus was acting under pressure, then the question became unavoidable. Who was pressuring him? And were they still doing it? Why do investigators sometimes avoid naming the most obvious person? Not because they don't see them, but because once a name is spoken, everything changes. Careers, institutions, expectations. And in this case, saying the name meant crossing a line no one could uncross. Up until now, The investigation had danced around a presence that felt everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Documents hinted at it. Emails referenced it indirectly. Decisions seemed to bend toward it without ever acknowledging it. Now, finally, the outline sharpened. The shell company authorization didn't come from Marcus. It came from a holding entity with layers designed to obscure origin. And when investigators peeled those layers back, they found a familiar pattern. A trust, a board, a signature authority, and one individual who sat at the intersection of all three. Let's call her Vivian Cross. Vivian wasn't a public figure in the traditional sense. She didn't give interviews. She didn't attend red carpets. She didn't appear in headlines. But she influenced them. She operated in the background, advising, funding, smoothing, redirecting. The kind of person who doesn't need to speak loudly because her decisions echo. Investigators had seen her name before, not in connection with violence, not in connection with scandal, in connection with solutions. Whenever a situation threatened to spiral, Vivian's fingerprints appeared nearby, not on the mess, on the cleanup. And that's what made her involvement so difficult to confront. Because systems don't defend villains. They defend fixers. So when the authorization trail led back to Vivian's office, the room went still. This wasn't about a rogue operator anymore. This was about hierarchy, about pressure flowing downward, about choices framed as necessities. Investigators requested records from Vivian's entities. The response was swift, polite, professional, comprehensive on the surface. But there were gaps. Meetings listed without agendas. Calls logged without summaries. Approvals granted without explanation. And those gaps clustered around one period. The same period Evelyn had been asking questions. The same period Marcus reconnected with Aaron. The same period the shell company vehicle was activated. Now here's the contradiction that complicated everything. There was no evidence Vivian ever instructed anyone to cause harm. None. What there was, however, was evidence of pressure. Subtle, consistent, unyielding. Emails that said things like, "This needs to be handled before it becomes external. Delay is not an option. Exposure would be destabilizing. Language matters." These weren't orders. They were expectations. And expectations, when transmitted. Now here's the emotional contradiction at the center of this section. Marcus insisted he never intended harm. He framed his actions as damage control, as prevention, as protecting people from consequences they didn't fully understand. And maybe, in his mind, that was true. But when you start involving security consultants off the books, when you start repositioning vehicles, when you start removing documents, intent becomes irrelevant. Outcome takes over. Investigators finally located Aaron 2 states away, staying under a short-term rental agreement. When they knocked on the door, he didn't run. He didn't deny who he was. He looked relieved, as if hiding had been harder than being found. Aaron's first statement was simple. "I didn't know anyone was going to die." That sentence matters, because it acknowledges involvement without admitting intent. He explained that Marcus had contacted him about a situation involving a client who was becoming unpredictable, someone who might expose sensitive information, someone who needed to be slowed down, not silenced, slowed. Aaron said he was asked for advice, not action. Advice on access, advice on schedules, advice on how to retrieve documents without causing alarm. And according to Aaron, he gave that advice. That alone changed the case. Because advising someone how to enter a home undetected is participation, even if you never step inside. Aaron claimed he refused to go to the property, claimed he stayed away, claimed he regretted getting involved at all. But regret doesn't erase consequence. When investigators asked him about the car seen leaving the property, Aaron hesitated. Then he said something that reframed everything. That wasn't supposed to happen. Those 4 words sent a shock through the room. Not supposed to happen implies expectation, a plan, a boundary that was crossed. Aaron explained that the original idea, as it was presented to him, involved retrieving documents while the occupants were asleep. No confrontation, no interaction, quiet, controlled, temporary. He said he warned Marcus against direct contact, warned him that emotions complicate operations, that family dynamics make situations unpredictable. Marcus, according to Aaron, didn't listen. He felt cornered, Aaron said. And cornered people improvise. Now pause and think about that. Improvisation in high-stakes situations is dangerous because it introduces variables no one controls. And that's where plans unravel. Investigators asked Aaron whether he believed Marcus entered the house himself. Aaron didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "If he did, it wasn't what we discussed." That answer didn't clear Marcus. It implicated him further, because it suggested Marcus went off script, which aligns with the evidence. The circling car, the delayed exit, the missing documents. It all pointed to someone adapting in real time. Now let's return to Nick. Because while investigators were piecing together Marcus and Aaron's roles, Nick was undergoing his own reckoning. He learned about the consultant. He learned about the documents. He learned that his parents' fears weren't hypothetical, and that realization crushed him. Friends described him as withdrawn, quiet, exhausted. He began questioning every interaction he'd had in recent months. Every argument, every dismissal, every moment he assumed his parents were just being overprotective. What if they were afraid? Not of him, but for him. That question reshaped Nick's emotional landscape, and it explained something investigators had struggled with.